Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would remind everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind to be sure cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin, it will be appreciated. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference, and our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, Walter served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council for 4 years. He has also held positions on the Senate staff, at one point serving as professional Republican staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, advising former Senator and the late Jesse Helms, as well as having served as a policy aide to Senator John McCain on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Mr. Lohman also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a seminar for the graduate level on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thanks, John. Thanks. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming out to see Jeff Smith talk about his new book. I think you saw the books out there. Cold Peace, China-Indian Rivalry in the 21st Century. I got to tell you, it's an outstanding book. You know, in this sort of bloggy world we all live in, it's a little bit hard to convey complexity and convey complexity in a compelling, readable way. You know, it's the other extreme, of course, is to get a book that's written in a university somewhere that requires a PhD to read. This book is both. It conveys the complexity of the relationship between China and India. At the same time, it's something that you can actually sit down and read. And it's got several endorsements on the back that are better than my endorsement. So I'd suggest going out and getting it and digesting it. It's very good. Jeff is here to talk to us about it. I'm going to just say a brief word of introduction. Jeff Smith's Director of South Asia Programs and the Creamer Strategy Fellow at American Foreign Policy Council. American Foreign Policy Council, as you may know, is a think tank in town. We do a lot of work with particularly on China and India, and we've collaborated before on other projects. Jeff's master's degree is from the University of Pittsburgh, where he got a degree in international public affairs. He also studied at Oxford. He's very well published. He doesn't have as much gray hair as a lot of folks that are focused on India relations, but he's got a lot of time to grow gray hair, and he's got a great book to start out what's going to be a long, distinguished studied career on U.S.-India relations, not to mention U.S.-China relations and China-India relations. So with that, let me introduce Jeff, and I think he's got some slides for us and talk about his book some. Thanks.
Thanks, Walter. Thanks to the Heritage Foundation, who we've been doing great work with over the years. Just last week, they hosted a great program here with the Indian ambassador. Thanks to Lisa Curtis, who does a lot of great work on South Asia here, and who I've known for many years. I consider a good friend. Thanks to the American Foreign Policy Council for supporting me through this book effort, and to the Smith Richardson Foundation for providing critical support to this project and to many other important projects. I'd note the Smith Richardson Foundation also supported Dr. John Garver's book on China-India relations, which covered the span of relations in the 20th century. And we're also an integral part of supporting this book. So we don't have a ton of time here. I'm not going to delve too much into the background or the intricacies of the 1962 border war. What I think we can do is get a brief overview of the evolution of China-India relations in the 21st century, the young 21st century, talk about where some of the main sticking points are, some of the main flashpoints in the relationship, go through a few slides, and if we have time, I've included a sort of mini slideshow of some pictures from travel in the border areas, which not too many Westerners have been exposed to. and then we can do some Q&A. So why should we care about China and India? That's probably a good place to start. I don't need to spend too much time convincing you all that China and India are rising in importance on the global stage. I mean, all the economic and demographic factors suggest that these two will be among sort of an elite club of powers sometime in this century. It may take them longer to get there than they would like, but already by GDP, by purchasing power parity metrics, they are the second and third largest economies in the world. They're fast developing first-rate militaries. India should have 3 aircraft carriers at sea in the next 5 to 10 years. China already has a very advanced military, including a navy with dozens of submarines, fast evolving air force. I mean, I think it's already almost a given fact that these two countries are rising and becoming regional, if not global, powers. But why do we need to put more attention on their relationship? I think we certainly have enough people here focusing on the U.S.-China and the U.S.-India relationship, but maybe a smaller number of people devoting analytic attention to the China-India relationship, and I think it does matter to us, and I think it matters to us for a lot of reasons. But the very simple one, the one that sort of boils it down easily for many Americans, is if you think that China poses a potential or potentially the greatest strategic challenge to the United States, and that is a hypothetical, I don't think that's a given, but it is a possibility, then the U.S. relationship with India and India's relationship with China matters a lot to us. It should matter a lot to us. And I think on that foundation alone, that should be enough impetus to say that this relationship requires more attention from our end. And it behooves us to better understand what makes this relationship tick. Because there is a lot of ambiguity about the relationship in the U.S. I think we have trouble defining it sometimes and understanding it. We see leaders from both countries cooperating at the diplomatic level on trade, on econ. I mean, the economic relationship expanded 67-fold between 1998 and 2012. And you see these elements of cooperation, and at the same time you hear that the two countries are involved in this deep rivalry. And I think there's just some ambiguity here about how we should interpret that relationship. And I think in many ways the easiest way to understand it, an example that close to home, is that it's not all that different from the U.S.-China relationship. That is, we continue engaging with China and deepening our engagement in the diplomatic and economic spheres, but in the security and in the political spheres, mistrust continues to build. So these are both sort of advancing at the same time. And although it sends conflicting messages about where the relationship is headed, I think within the China-India relationship, there's no question that elements of rivalry have constituted an important and at times overwhelming dynamic. So the book was designed to try and shed some light on those elements of rivalry, to take a look at each in a sort of chapter-by-chapter discussion of the main points of contention in the relationship. So let's go briefly through where the two countries are headed and what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years. I would say that they entered the 21st century on arguably the best footing than at any time since the 1950s. Now, the 1950s is the first time, what you could call their first honeymoon. Both relatively new countries, 1947 for India, 1949 for communist China. The first, despite being a democratic and a communist country, for the first decade they actually got along quite well. It looked like they had both inherited a border dispute from their predecessors, the longest disputed border in the world, but they made attempts to sort of paper over this and settle it diplomatically on terms favorable to both sides with a gentleman's agreement. Indian Prime Minister traveled to Beijing in 1954 and was well received, and everything looked as if relations, despite their sort of difference in government and difference in interests, relations would be on a positive trajectory. Now, without going too much into the border war, that quickly devolved, and by the late 1950s, the two were sort of sparring over Tibet, which China had sort of reoccupied in 1950 and then crushed a popular rebellion in 1959, sending the Dalai Lama fleeing into India. And the border dispute sort of reignited as this gentleman's agreement they had kind of talked about through back channels fell apart, and eventually aggressive border patrolling from both sides devolved into open conflict. China invaded in 1962. And this short but traumatic border war in October and November of 1962 ended with China in possession of disputed territory in the western side of their border dispute, and China unilaterally withdrawing in the eastern sector, leaving India part of the disputed territory, as you can see in the map over there. And the status quo set by that conflict has endured for the past 50 years, with China in possession of Aksai Chin in the western sector and India in possession of Arunachal Pradesh in the eastern sector. So it took them about a decade and a half before they were able to reestablish diplomatic relations in 1976. And over the ensuing 20 years, you saw these gradual steps toward a normalization of the relationship. In 1981, they started their first border talks. In 1988, the Indian Prime Minister traveled to China. In 1993, they signed their first real substantive agreement on the border that helped provide a framework for managing the border dispute. And there was a follow-up in 1996. And as things normalized at the political level, the economic relationship soon began to follow in the 1990s, really picking up steam. So it looked in 2000 as if they were entering this new century on somewhat of a high note, including cooperating on issues of mutual interest at the global level, trade talks, climate change. And this momentum carried into the 2000s. I would say in the early 2000s, they were able to sign 2 additional border protocols in 2003 and 2005 that really raised hopes in some corners that they would come up with a resolution to this border dispute. Now, this has been going on 50 years now. I saw recently they held the 17th Special Representatives talks on the border dispute. That's actually a little deceiving because it's just the 17th round of the Special Representatives. It's actually the 50 or 52nd round of border talks if you count all the different manifestations they've had, the Joint Working Group, and it's quite remarkable. And these agreements in the early 2000s sort of raised some hope that finally maybe we could get a border resolution. They appointed special representatives from the Prime Minister's office and a high-ranking official in China, the state counselor, to handle this, to really upgrade the diplomatic representation and try and drive home a resolution. And yet, around 2006, everything seemed to change. Almost all the momentum, I would say, heading into 2005 was lost. And over the past 6 or 7 years, you've seen the elements of rivalry really return to the surface, and the contentious issues in the relationship again overtake the areas for cooperation. And a lot of these you've heard before. I'll sort of go through them quickly, but there's been a military buildup on both sides of the line of actual control. India just last year announced its first big offensive strike corps formation for the China-India border to be deployed to the eastern sector. Now, they have 3 other strike corps, but all of them have been dedicated to the Pakistan border. So the first deployment of a major offensive formation to the China border is a serious affair. And that follows on the deployment of 2 mountain infantry divisions in 2009. The deployment of India's most advanced fighter aircraft, advanced cruise missiles, and this is really an effort to keep pace with China, who has come gone leaps and bounds ahead of India over the past several decades in building infrastructure in Tibet. China is able to facilitate troop movements, supplies, even civilian movements along its side of the China-India border, high atop the flat Tibetan plateau, much easier than India is. India still has to supply a lot of its deep border positions by air or by grueling, multi-day trek. So there's been this buildup on both sides, starting in 2006 when India announced it was going to build 72 strategic roads to help facilitate better movement in the border areas, and then the troop deployments I just spoke of. China has done less to make sort of big splash announcements about forces it's deploying. Rather, it's been steadily increasing the capabilities of the forces already there, including deploying fighter jets who are able to operate at very high altitudes at a much greater degree and capability than their predecessors. So, along this border, which I think actually has been managed quite well, there has not been a deadly incident across the border since the 1970s, but there are hiccups there quite often. You may have heard of last year in April there was a major incident where a Chinese border patrol crossed the line of actual control some 19 kilometers into Indian territory and set up camp there for 3 weeks. Now this was quite unusual. There are border incursions, reported border incursions every year, several hundred of them, that India reports. And while China doesn't keep count the same way that India does, officials will tell you in private that they think the number of Indian border incursions is around the same. They just don't announce it. And that's partially because the two sides have not yet even exchanged maps on where they perceive the line of actual control to be. So there are several stretches where neither side knows where its border patrols have the right to go. And they play a game where they go into the disputed territory and leave, noodle packets or mark their territory on a rock and go back. And these are relatively harmless exercises, but there are several hundred of them a year. So there is a minor escalation risk there. But what happened last April was a little different, where instead of sort of coming across the border briefly, doing your thing, and then going back to your base camp at night, they literally went into the Indian territory and set up camp. And unfortunately, we are left scratching our heads, us and many in Delhi, as to what China's intentions were, particularly because it sort of spoiled the atmosphere surrounding the first big visits between the incoming Chinese administration and the Indian government. But the border, that's a long way of saying, while peaceful, the border is still a point of contention, a source of contention in the relationship, and there are still sort of mini incidents that happen each year that keep the issue front and center. They keep it from going away. And frankly, one of the more remarkable things for this book was the impression I got from Chinese and Indian officials about the prospects for a resolution of the border dispute, which is to say, not good. I mean, many were very frank in saying that the prospects for a resolution in the medium or even long term look very dim, or don't expect any movement on this issue in the next 10 to 15 years. And this is after 50-some rounds of border negotiations, that essentially they've resigned themselves to the fact that a quick resolution isn't forthcoming, and we might as well sort of try and continue to manage it as best we can. So moving past the border, I think Tibet has continued to be a source of friction in the relationship. It is in some ways, like the border dispute, at the core of the China-India rivalry and what helped propel them to war in 1962. It wasn't just the border dispute, it really was Chinese perceptions of Indian interference in Tibet, and then Indian accepting the Dalai Lama when he fled from China in 1959. And ever since then, it's been a source of contention. Now, when China has felt more secure in Tibet, I think it has been less of an issue between the two governments. Part of the problem is over the past decade, China has not always felt so secure in Tibet. There were a series of riots across Tibet in 2008, and beginning in 2009, you saw Buddhist monks began setting themselves on fire in these self-immolations to protest Chinese rule. And you've seen developments on the other side, too. The Dalai Lama has renounced his political authority to a prime minister of the Tibetan government in exile, which is housed in Dharamsala, India. And the Dalai Lama has begun to talk about his succession. He's 78 years old. He's not going to last another 30 years, one would imagine. So people are beginning to wonder what will happen when the Dalai Lama passes. And really, this is in some ways the most interesting dynamic or potentially problematic dynamic in China-India relations moving forward. Because what China is essentially trying to do is to position itself to say, we are the only ones who can pick the Dalai Lama's successor. They passed a series of regulations in 2005 and in 2007 trying to gain a hold over the management of succession for all Buddhas, and including for the Dalai Lama. And they've essentially said what we're going to do is go back to a precedent set several hundred years ago, which said that when a Dalai Lama passes, he's chosen through a golden urn lottery process where we throw hats, names in a hat, and then somebody picks it out, and that's the new Dalai Lama. It's no surprise that they have been concerned about the Dalai Lama's activities in India. They say he's promoting separatism in Tibet. They think he's causing them, a great deal of trouble there. They haven't produced a tremendous amount of evidence showing what the Dalai Lama is doing to cause them trouble in Tibet. But they certainly hope that when he passes, they're banking on the movement fracturing and a Chinese-appointed Dalai Lama gaining greater control over Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lama several years ago came out and said that no one has the right to name my successor, and rather than the traditional process, which was after my passing, either a regent or a council of lamas would search for my reincarnation somewhere and then be groomed over a decade to be the next Dalai Lama. Instead of that, what I'm going to do is promote what I would call emanation, and essentially say that I can pick my successor before my death. Now, this is somewhat unusual in the course of Dalai Lamas. It had been done for lower-ranking lamas, but it's somewhat unusual for him to grant himself this authority. But by all indications, most Tibetans are, there's been no pushback against that within the sort of religious hierarchy of Tibetan Buddhism. And he said, I'm not going to fully go into details on how this is going to work until I turn 90 in another decade or another 12 years. But they've given indications on sort of how they're going. They've fired the opening shots, I guess, in this struggle. And it's obviously an issue of monumental importance to a global religion, but particularly in the context of China-India relations, how this plays out will have a big effect. Because while the border dispute is maybe the biggest issue in the relationship from India's perspective, from China's perspective, I would say the hosting of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan exile government in India is the most sensitive issue from their perspective. And if the next Dalai Lama were to take a more provocative line toward China, or if the movement were simply to fragment or fracture, and you saw greater militancy among Tibetan youth, it could pose a real problem for China-India relations. So, aside from those two sort of core issues in China-India, you saw a host of sort of friction points. China stapling visas to Indian citizens from Kashmir and Arunachal Pradesh. Chinese infrastructure projects in Kashmir. You saw some water security issues, concerns about China damming the Brahmaputra River and how that could affect water flow into India. And then the maritime security arena is is sort of the big one, which I believe, yeah, these give you a good picture of the environment in China-India relations, the maritime security environment. So one of the interesting things about this rivalry in the 20th century was that it was almost entirely a continental rivalry. That is, there was not a big conflict of interest at sea between these two countries for most of the 20th century, and that's because their navies simply did not have the capabilities or interest in operating in the other's sphere of influence. That they didn't really have their own interests in the maritime arena, China in the Indian Ocean or India in the Western Pacific. And what's remarkable is how much that's changed in a relatively short period of time. Since the turn of the century, you have seen the two navies start to branch out more in each other's territory. You've seen India with significant economic interests in the Western Pacific, energy investments off the Vietnamese coast, and a general interest in maintaining the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. China, I would say that the change has been even more profound, as they've really only recently become a major importer of energy. I mean, it was only in the 1990s and the late 2000s that they began importing a large share of their oil and gas needs. They were largely energy independent in these arenas for most of the 20th century. And since that time, their dependence on seaborne oil and gas has grown significantly. And almost all of those, certainly the oil imports, gas to a lesser degree, but the oil imports come from the Middle East and North Africa, which means all of China's critical sea lines of communication come through the Indian Ocean and through the Strait of Malacca. So you've seen China's presence in the Indian Ocean grow, mainly through an anti-piracy mission off the coast of Somalia, but within that context, a growing debate inside China about the utility of protecting these vulnerable sea lines of communication. They've long had a policy of no overseas bases, no interference in other countries' affairs, but as you have global interests, you begin becoming less content to rely on the United States and India to protect your sea lines of communication. And you've seen, a low-level debate beginning to take place. Well, maybe we should reconsider this idea that we don't need overseas military bases. We don't need overseas deployments to protect our interests abroad. And I think it's only inevitable that these two, massive countries with expanding spheres of influence, as they continue to overlap, you're going to continue to see friction points. And I think the maritime arena is one of the most important areas for that. And they'll continue, I think, this shows LNG travel to the Western Pacific. As you can see, what's interesting about this is most of the LNG actually is already fed into the supply chain east of the Strait of Malacca. So not a lot of it has to come through the strait. Oil, on the other hand, comes almost exclusively from the Middle East and North Africa. So that's why many of you have probably heard Chinese officials coin the term Malacca dilemma, because they are critically dependent on energy supplies through this narrow strait between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And if a country were in a conflict with China and wanted to find a way to do serious harm to China, they could potentially target this energy supply chain through the strait. That shows you the course of global shipping lanes. And what's really interesting about that is if you track the shipping lanes, you find that on their way to the Strait of Malacca, they pass right underneath India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Now, there's a whole chapter on these islands in the book. A long story short, these have been in Indian territory since the 50s, but really only recently have they sought to build up the military capabilities on these islands, really just establishing their first major command there in 2001, and I would say very slowly increasing the capabilities and attention and importance they place on the islands. But they are positioned to play a very critical role in this, emerging Indo-Pacific strategic sphere and strategic environment. And they're a place that we should, I think, be focusing more attention on. Most of the shipping that travels through the Strait of Malacca goes through the 6-degree channel there, which, ironically, most people don't know, also must pass through the exclusive economic zone of India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So they're sort of uniquely positioned at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca, I would say. And they give India a significant strategic advantage in the Indian Ocean. And I would sort of recommend the chapter in the book on this because, frankly, a lot of people have never even heard of the islands, and really don't understand their role in this Indo-Pacific construct. I could probably go on for another hour, but that would put more of you to sleep than I already have. So let me go through really quickly some of the pictures of what it's like to travel up along the China-India border, and then we can hit Q&A. This is actually in Dharamsala, the Dalai Lama's palace. What I think is really, this is looking toward the Pakistan border in Kashmir, not far from Srinagar. Really beautiful place. Again, in Kashmir, driving now towards Ladakh and Leh through Shia parts of Kashmir, near Dras, Kargil. These are the type of roads that you spend 9 hours a day on, climbing these steep mountainsides with no guardrails on, bumpy, rough conditions. And, India had, it was in 2006 initiated this road building program for the border areas. And it's been hung up on environmental clearances and, a lack of, that's Pangong Lake in Kashmir, off Ladakh. China is in possession of 2/3 of the lake, India and 1/3. It crosses the line of actual control in Kashmir. This is in India's Arunachal Pradesh, as you approach the Himalayas and the border areas. Another example of the windy roads. I mean, it's quite beautiful, but also very treacherous. Not for the faint of heart. 9 hours a day, 8 hours a day on these type of roads. But it underscores how much of a disadvantage India remains in trying to defend and supply these border areas. And it's in large part because until very, very recently, it was the intention of the Indian government not to develop the border areas. The logic was, if we build up our infrastructure there, it would only facilitate an advancing force. So let's make it as hard as possible for any potential invasion force to make it to our vulnerable foothills, which of course alternatively made it almost impossible to defend your forward positions. So as part of this sort of change in psychology and this road building program and these new deployments to the Northeast was a change in this doctrine, where the Indian Defense Minister essentially came out and said, we were wrong. We should not have promoted, this has set us back, and it's time to reverse course and actually build up the border areas so that we can adequately defend them if needed. It's just taking some time, as you can see. So, should we go to some Q&A?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Let me open it up. I did want to ask you one question, because I know sometimes it helps people get their juices flowing for me to take some time and ask a question myself.
Okay.
So let me ask you, I've heard many times from the Indian side that there's long been the framework of a deal on the border. This is kind of basic common sense. Chinese get the part in the in the west that they control. Indians get the part that they control in the east, and I think the conventional wisdom on the Indian side and among a lot of analysts is that the Chinese don't actually want a deal, and largely because of the Dalai Lama's exile in India, and that as long as the Dalai Lama is in India, they will always want some sort of friction in the relationship, because, it's a similar logic they use in the South China Sea and elsewhere. They don't really want to give the United States or anyone else any comfort in those areas, because then we'll never accede to their broader strategic design. But I wonder if you could comment on that,
Sure.
whether you think that holds or not.
I'm going to give you a drawn-out and overlong answer to that question because it's
Okay.
an important one. Maybe we can bring, yeah. So, it's a great question, and essentially at the core is, why has it taken this long for them to resolve the border dispute, and why does at least one side seem not to have an interest in resolving it? And sort of implicit in Walter's comment is, and just to give some background, in the 1950s, China, through back channels, sort of informally proposed, let's just do a swap, which is you keep most of the territory you're claiming in Arunachal Pradesh, we'll keep most of what we're claiming in Aksai Chin, the white area, and we'll call it even. It was never a formal proposal, they never fleshed out the details, but the Chinese leadership at the most senior level at least indicated privately and sometimes publicly that they were open to this kind of deal. That fell apart with the border war, obviously. But again, even after the border war, Chinese leaders kind of signaled that this status quo swap proposal was something they were interested in. And the Indian side demurred. I mean, they essentially said we should negotiate this issue by issue. And frankly, we think that the eastern sector, the sector that we are claiming, is more of a settled issue. That they signed this accord in 1911 or 1914, the Simla Accord, that sort of enshrined their claim over Arunachal Pradesh and the McMahon Line, but that the western sector was more genuinely disputed, that this place, there really was, no side really had a solid claim, and that we should focus our negotiations there. Again, China was offering this swap, and India was kind of saying, no, we should negotiate this in more detail. Strangely, what happened was, in the mid-1980s, China began to signal that, yes, we kind of want to swap, but Tawang, which is an important town, an important district, which you can see on the map in the black, would have to be transferred to China. They began placing specific emphasis on Tawang. And this really, I think, at a time when, frankly, Delhi started becoming maybe more amenable to the idea of a border swap, maybe this isn't such a bad deal, I think that essentially raised the stakes and poisoned it. I mean, Indian officials made very clear Tawang is simply not on the table. It will not be conceded. So China seemed to make a demand on this territory that they know is unacceptable to the Indians. And the question, and in fact, they've been continuing to place emphasis on Tawang in subsequent rounds of border negotiations since the 80s. I mean, that, if you're looking for the biggest sticking point in the border negotiations, it is on Tawang. But what happened in the 1980s? Like, one of the questions was, why would they suddenly place so much emphasis on it? And one of the things that was happening in the 80s was the Dalai Lama. In the early 80s, Deng invited him back to Tibet, began talks with special representatives from the Dalai Lama, and by the mid-'80s, those talks collapsed, and sort of this hope that they could bring the Dalai Lama back into the fold in Tibet really was quashed. And it's hard to really decipher their thinking, but we all know and think that they do make a strategic connection between the border dispute and the Tibet issue. And it's quite possible that they have, as you suggested, in their mind said, so long as India maintains this influence in Tibet, or this point of leverage in Tibet, we don't have an interest in settling the border dispute.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
My name is Pratik and
We got a microphone for you.
My name is Pratik and I go to Dickinson College. And I had a question about the security implications of China's increased investment into natural gas extraction in Afghanistan and minerals extraction as well. And it's been increasingly invested in those regions. And there is a historical precedent for its fear of shipping line disruption. And so while China has a historical idea that it will not build ports or invest in security networks around the world and impinge on other countries' sovereignties, how do they explain the Gwadar port and their investment in the region, and what is the Indian political/military response to that?
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure you've heard, and many of you have heard the term "the string of pearls" before. That was became popular in the mid-2000s. A report by Booz Allen Hamilton coined the term 2004, essentially to put a tag to a series of Chinese investments in the Indian Ocean Rim countries, one of them being the Gwadar port in Pakistan, but others in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Burma. The initial concern was that, particularly from India, I think a bit inflated, that we're being surrounded by this string of Chinese military bases, and they're sort of closing the noose around our neck. I think in recent years, the more people looked into these investments, including the one in Gwadar, they realized that there were no explicit military basing rights or reciprocal military agreements, that they had essentially jumped the gun a bit, and some of the ones, including in the Cocoa Islands, were simply weren't there, or were much less than was being publicly promoted. So it's sort of, okay, let's take a step back. Maybe these are genuine commercial ventures, a lot of them. But my own sense is that this concern over the string of pearls in the Indian Ocean may not have been wrong. It may have just been premature. That from China's perspective, what these agreements like in Gwadar have done is begin to lay the groundwork for a more durable presence in the Indian Ocean. And the anti-piracy mission in particular, in the mid-2000s, there was an Islamist takeover in Somalia, and a number of countries around the world, not just China, began to run anti-piracy missions off the Horn of Africa. And China's been doing that since 2008. And what it's done is given them a lot of experience operating in ports in Djibouti, in Yemen, Oman, and Pakistan, where they do have these, they're not military bases, but they give China experience operating a blue water type naval force and in these ports. And, it's all going to be linked to this notion of their comfort with the idea of having overseas military bases, but I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now you did see explicit bases and arrangements for the Chinese military in the Indian Ocean. I think, the concerns may have just been premature rather than wrong. What's the Indian response been? Officially they've welcomed the anti-piracy mission in the Indian Ocean, but it doesn't take long before privately they tell you they would like the Chinese to go home when that's finished. There's already been at least one incident in the Indian Ocean with Indian Navy submarine tracking the Chinese flotilla and then being confronted and being forced to surface. And they've had similar, minor but problematic confrontations and issues in the South China Sea. So the question is good, and I think the maritime security dynamics in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific are places where we should be devoting a lot of our attention and are likely to grow in importance as we move forward.
Great, thank you. Glad you raised that. Lisa?
Hi, Lisa Curtis from Heritage Foundation. Great to see you, Jeff, and excellent book. Really have enjoyed the talk. I have two questions. One is, given your research on the ongoing rivalry between China and India on the border and the chance that, we could feasibly see some kind of border conflict breaking out, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. Do you think that the U.S. would how do you think the U.S. would react to such a border conflict? And I ask this because in India, there's a great deal of skepticism. The debate there is, we can't count on the U.S. to pull our chestnuts out of the fire if we were to get into some type of border conflict with China. And there's even differences on how the U.S. reaction to the 1962 war was. I mean, I look at it that the U.S. did extend military help, was willing to help India, but the conflict was very brief and it ended before there really was the opportunity for the U.S. to do much. But in India, I hear a lot, well, the U.S. did nothing, they didn't help us, that's really, overstated, there wasn't much help. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And my second question is, given the, terrorist attack in the train station in China, China seems to be increasingly concerned about the Uyghurs and what happens in Afghanistan after the NATO-U.S. withdrawal. Do you think there is potential for more cooperation between India and China, say in Afghanistan or against terrorism writ large? Because it seems like maybe their interests are starting to converge in a small way in Afghanistan because of the increased terrorist threat to China.
Okay, great questions. There's the short answer to the question is, what would the U.S. do if there were a conflict at the border? We don't know. I know Delhi would like to have more certainty on that issue, a better understanding, a better sense of where America stands. But we don't know, and frankly, it would probably depend a lot on the circumstances that led to said conflict. I would note that I've sort of looked into this issue myself. So America's position on the border dispute is that we fully recognize India's claim in the eastern sector, that in our opinion, Arunachal Pradesh border is a settled border, and it is not a disputed territory. The western sector we consider a disputed territory that we want both sides to resolve bilaterally. Now, when I was going to write a piece for this a year or two or so ago, I said, well, when was the last time the U.S. stood up and reaffirmed its support of India's position, which is the McMahon line? That's what the international border is today. When was the last time the U.S. said, China, stop these border incursions, the McMahon line is the international border? And the answer from the State Department was, we don't know. We have no idea. Our records, their records go back 10 years, and they said they couldn't find a single public mention of this support. So I wrote that in an op-ed midway through last year, and ironically, about a month or two later, somebody was questioning the U.S. ambassador to India about this, and they came out and said, we support the McMahon line, and that's the international border. So we've now had our first public mention of the matter in the past, at least decade. But actually, the bigger question you raised, which is the good one, is what is the U.S. role in this China-India dynamic? And that's probably one I could have started with the U.S. audience. The main role of the U.S. in this relationship is that its relationship with India has fundamentally transformed in the past decade. India always sought a superpower sort of benefactor to balance against China. China has always been the more powerful country in this relationship. Today, its GDP and its military spending are 4 times the size of India's. That's always been the case. And India has always sought to balance against China. And as you brought up, in the 1962 border war, this was turning to the United States for tactical help. Even though this wasn't a particularly robust relationship before the border war, they did turn the U.S. for aid, and the U.S., to President Kennedy's credit, did supply what he could in the month-long conflict and was considering a request for much more substantial aid when the war abruptly ended. Now, that tactical partnership fell apart 3 years later because India and Pakistan went to war for the second time in 1965, and Washington essentially said, to hell with both of you, we're cutting off aid to both countries, and that's it. And by 1971, India was courting the Soviet Union as its big balancer against China because Sino-Soviet ties had faltered. And from 71 to 91, it was the Soviet Union that was India's big supporter and benefactor and balancer. And in the 2000s, we fundamentally changed our relationship with India and in some ways sort of restored that superpower dynamic, that India again had a country that was more powerful than China, serving as a friend. But possibly India's biggest concern, and some think it's in some ways its main reluctance to come closer to the U.S., is not this sort of outdated philosophy of non-alignment, but the concern that the U.S. is not always a reliable ally, and a concern, in my opinion, inflated in some ways, that the U.S. is always on the verge of some kind of strategic accommodation with China, that we never quite know when Washington is going to decide that it's going to hop on board the China train and leave its allies out to fend for themselves. And I think, the talk of the G2 in the Obama administration early in the term that would sort of work with China to manage global affairs, just the two of us behind closed doors. Another time in the Obama administration, they initiated a sub-dialogue on South Asia, which sort of raised questions about, why are you talking with China behind closed doors and coordinating your South Asia policy? And these sort of, bring up memories of the U.S. in 1971, sort of abruptly, after decades of estrangement, deciding to go and cozy up to China. In India, I'm sure they would think at their expense. The big rapprochement with China happened right on the eve of the Third Indo-Pakistan War, which suddenly they found themselves aligned against the United States, Pakistan, and China, which forced them, in those same months, to sign their defense pact with the Soviet Union.
I think that's an important question about how the U.S. would react, because, frankly, for maybe entirely different reasons, I share the Indian worry about that, because I'm not sure that we are not always on the verge of coming to some sort of strategic accommodation with the Chinese, especially over the last 4 or 5 years. At least before that, you had the Bush administration's very vigorous and standing commitment to India. I mean, they're the ones that created this relationship, and so the Indians could always point to that and kind of take some reassurance in that. But it does seem to me on a number of issues that we could any moment switch, and so we're all trying to read the tea leaves, including the Indians. We have a question on from our internet
We have an internet question, and instead of trying to print it, if you'll pardon me, I'll read it. In view of the pessimism about a resolution of the China-India border control and the increase of military force along that border, what is the prospect for outright conflict between the two states, for example, in comparison with the prospect for conflict between China and the U.S., which is a topic more often raised?
Okay. I sort of give a breakdown at the end of the book on sort of the likelihood of conflict, the degree to which each issue could bring about conflict or increased tensions. In general, I think the prospect for a total war or an outright conflict, particularly over the border dispute, is low. Not impossible, but low. As you go down the chain, though, the possibility for a limited conflict or the escalation of a border incident, or, you know, some in India would tell you potentially a swift maneuver just to seize or slice off a tiny chunk of the disputed territory, like Tawang, you begin rising up the probability chain. And the possibility of simply increased tensions on a number of fronts is very high. So I don't expect to see a conflict between the two sides anytime soon, but there are game changers, right? I think the Dalai Lama succession issue is a potential game changer. And just the uncertain internal dynamics in China is a potential game changer. Both of these countries are poised to go through a tremendous amount of turbulence, rising sort of this fast. The countries this large rising this fast in this close proximity to one another is there's not many historical precedents for this. So yeah.
Good, good. You have another question? Maybe the last one.
Thank you. Actually, Lisa asked quite a bit of my question. But maybe you could say a little bit more about Russia and how it plays into this relationship. Because obviously there are very strong bilateral relationships between the two states in Russia. But you know, how does that play bilaterally, and then how do the three come together? And then again, in relation to US interests in the region.
Excuse me. It's a good question, and you know, in hindsight, maybe it's remarkable how little Russia came up in discussions with officials from both countries about their bilateral relationship. I mean, as many of you know, the Soviet Union was a very strong patron of India for a long time, and it did have a big role to play in China-India relations in the 20th century. In the 21st century, I mean, Russia has always tried to play somewhat of a balancing act between the two countries, including in the run-up to the border war. Initially supporting India when the first clashes broke out in 1959 at the China-India border, despite being sort of, at that time, still a communist cousin of China. Since then, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has maintained a very robust military relationship with India. It certainly doesn't have the monopoly it once did, and India has been trying to move away from single sourcing to the Russian military with some success over recent years. So that political and defense relationship remains very important from, I would say, India's perspective, though not as important as it once was. And you've seen Russia-China ties on about as good a footing as they've been in a long time. But what that means from Moscow's perspective is it doesn't behoove them to get involved in any part of the China-India rivalry and to continue to sort of remain aloof or above any sparring between the two countries. So you just haven't seen, when you dig down into the main dynamics in the relationship, the main points of contention, you just haven't seen a big role for Russia there.
Great. I think we got to leave it there. But you know, I just wanted to say in closing and introducing you, I talked about the way that you convey complexity and how well you do that. You know, there's a reason why people still write books, right? Because some issues are extremely complex and you can't really deliver them all in the course of a presentation or in a blog post or in a 4,000-word document. I think one thing the book does that you can't do entirely here is talk about India-China relations a little bit more in the capacity they have. I think getting to Lisa's second question there, because I think that's an important part of the equation, because many of us, I'll admit myself to being sort of seduced a little bit 5 or 6 years ago by the prospect for U.S.-India strategic alignment vis-a-vis China. And I think that was a little overstated. The narrative was a little bit too strong 5 years ago, and got many of us a little bit too excited maybe about India. And so now we're kind of on the down slope, and we're recalibrating and trying to appreciate it in a different way. And your book will go a long way towards establishing a new baseline, I think, for what we can expect out of the relationship. The other thing about about the book and way you convey things that I find very compelling and very, very useful is that it's orderly. You know, I mean, a lot of us are in the business of thinking. You know, this is a think tank. You know, we don't always think very orderly. But your book is organized in a very efficient way. And your presentation was too. I like the way you handle questions in a very orderly fashion. And it makes for a convincing argument. So the book is filled with that stuff. Thanks so much for coming over and talking to us about it.
Thank you, Walter.